So, what is the idea of week two? In a general sense, it is just to begin the work that is actually specific to this course, and that is to start looking at issues in computer ethics. Obviously, week one, which I consider to be a very valuable thing to do, was preparatory to that, to give us a shared touchstone, shared reference in terms of applying perhaps a little more rigorously than we usually do, a decision making framework that's actually more formal and maybe a little bit more explicitly thought out than we usually do. But this week we actually begin to look at issues in digital technology, and the first one is the ethics of autopilot. So, in a sense, all we're doing is beginning the actual subject matter of the course after looking generally at some very quickly scanned things in general moral theory. What specifically this does have to do with the ethics of autopilot, obviously, and whether this turns out to be any kind of deep challenge to human ethics in general or not, I suppose we have to wait. But there are certainly some very interesting issues and problems and maybe even dilemmas that are posed by this issue. On one hand, I think all of the evidence that I've seen points to the idea that if autopilot is widely implemented, becomes a standard for at least for passenger vehicles, commercial vehicles on roads, cars and trucks, that we will overall, in a utilitarian sense, see a big benefit, because the truth of the matter is that autopilot promises to be better at driving than human beings. That is, we will have fewer accidents, fewer injuries, fewer deaths. But on the other hand, there are all sorts of problems in implementing that. And maybe the central problem is that we actually do have to implement it. That is, it's quite clear that in normal driving, let's say, although I'm not a driver, so I'm not really sure what normal driving is, but in normal driving, it's a no-brainer in terms of whether you would want a human being behind the wheel or you would want the vehicle to be automated. That is, that it's just there will be fewer accidents. So, from a utilitarian standpoint, there's just no question that we should. It would be rational to adopt autopilot widely, if not universally. On the other hand, there will be situations in which we will not be able to achieve an optimal outcome in terms of every human being or every living being coming out of this thing alive or whole. That is, the whole moral machine experiment, the moral machine survey, sets you with situations in which not everyone will live, not everyone will be spared, and forces you to make certain calculations, decisions about the least bad outcome, let's say. And so the whole process of which will be a necessary process, I certainly agree with the moral machine people who devised the whole thing, that we will be forced to come up with an algorithm or a set of algorithms to actually deal with these emergency situations, and how exactly we will do it is a matter of contention. I just want to point you to one passage in the moral machine essay, a moral machine article, that I found particularly striking and maybe gave me some insight to what is actually going on here. This is, I guess, the second page where they start talking about the results of their survey. What actually did people in these scenarios, what were the major trends of what people actually decided? As shown in figure 2, the strongest preferences are observed for sparing humans over animals, sparing more lives, and sparing young lives. Accordingly, these three preferences may be considered essential building blocks for machine ethics. Well, that's quite interesting. And what I mean in terms of gave me a clue to what's going on is the moral machine surveys, what they're really doing are trying to discover what our core ethical principles actually are, our shared core ethical principles. And it seems to me that sparing humans over animals, sparing more lives, and sparing young lives are fairly sound. That is, you have to test these things against your own intuitions. Are humans more important than animals? I would have to say yes. So they should always be chosen over animals. Are more lives better than sparing more lives? Is that better than sparing fewer? Yes. That's a more difficult one, but I would say generally speaking, not as an exceptionalist rule, but as an intuition about that should guide us, yes. Sparing young lives over older lives, that's even more problematic, but I'd have to say that although would be a difficult choice in practice, it does jibe with my own intuitions, my own ethical intuitions about what principles would actually guide these very difficult decision making things. So the moral machine experiment, which is questionable in its basis, and that was the reason that I gave you one of the study questions that asked whether the democratic approach was the proper one. And I do believe that this is a democratic approach. That is, the whole idea here in the moral machine experiment is that we should find out what people want, what people generally think about these situations and how they should be resolved. That is to say, that that perhaps should be what guides us. And I think it is questionable insofar as we don't believe, generally speaking, that moral decisions should be based upon consensus, always leaving open the possibility that the majority opinion could be wrong. And perhaps we should leave this to ethicists, or we should at least decide these things not on the basis of consensus, but on the basis of what actually is most reasonable, which is not necessarily what is what is the most agreed upon consensual view. On the other hand, I think the idea that in doing something like this, we are becoming aware of what our shared core principles are is probably a sound way of approaching the thing. So, what is the idea of week 2? Well, of course, it's just to begin the specific work of looking at issues in computer ethics, but more specific to the actual issue. It's looking at difficulties in implementing some sort of decision-making procedure for automated vehicles, for Autopilot, to make decisions about human life. And that is a fateful, fateful step. Whether a human being should relinquish control over these things in making these decisions to an algorithm is itself an ethical question, even if it turned out that on a utilitarian basis, the conversion to Autopilot is an unquestionable good because it will avoid the kind of human suffering that utilitarianism is structured to try to avoid, the avoidable human suffering. It is a fateful step to relinquish that kind of control, and there's all sorts of issues that are involved in doing so. However, and that really goes to the heart of whether or not we want Autopilot, because I think it's clear that if we do implement Autopilot, that we will be forced to program the vehicle to respond in some way to emergency situations. And so we will have to make these sort of decisions. But again, that is a fateful step. So, yeah, I think that the idea of week 2, it's pretty interesting, as any really substantive ethical issue is always interesting and troubling and frightening in a way. So here we begin that process of trying to come up with some sort of rational approach to these very novel issues, which are set by the emergence of digital technology.